Welcome to this story, one of the most unsettling cases ever noted in England. Before we dive in, share in the comments where you're tuning in from and the exact time you started listening. It's always interesting to see the different places and hours of the day or night where these stories reach. It was the spring of 1824 when Eliza Turner first arrived at the quiet market town of Hadleigh, Suffolk. The morning air hung damp with mist from the River Brett, and the bells from St. Mary's Tower tolled faintly through the fog. Witnesses later said she stepped down from a black coach dressed in mourning gray, her veil heavy, her gloves perfectly clean. She told the innkeeper she was recently widowed, seeking temporary lodging until her late husband's estate could be settled. Hadleigh was not unused to visitors, yet her poise drew attention. The butcher's wife described her as neither gentlewoman nor servant, something betwixt, with a schooling to her. She rented a small brick cottage near the edge of town, close enough to the mill road, yet far enough that her lamps glowed alone at night. Few knew then that just a few miles east, the newspapers were already whispering of another tragedy. The case of Maria Martin, later known in scandal sheets as the Red Barn murder. That crime would cast a long shadow over the countryside, shaping how villagers judged every stranger who came their way. When Eliza Turner arrived, the memory of Maria's fate was still raw, and caution lingered in every conversation. The local parish records list Eliza as 21, widow of Jonathan Turner, trader. Yet no Jonathan Turner appears in county registries. The discrepancy, unnoticed at first, would later unravel everything. For now, she was simply the quiet young woman who paid her rent in silver coin, kept few visitors, and walked daily at dusk toward the fields beyond the mill. Children whispered about her house, saying she never opened her shutters before noon. A milkmaid swore she saw candlelight flickering through the cellar grates long after midnight, and once, in early June, a carter returning late claimed he heard a woman's voice crying from the direction of her garden, though when he called out, the sound ceased abruptly. The vicar, Reverend Allenby, wrote in his private journal, "The widow Turner attends service without speaking a word. Her eyes, like glass, reflect nothing. I know not if she listens, prays, or merely endures." By midsummer, her landlord noticed the earth behind her cottage had been freshly turned, rectangular patches as though for vegetable beds, though nothing grew there. When asked, she replied softly, "It is better to bury what will not bloom." He assumed she spoke of grief. But Hadleigh would learn that her mourning was not the quiet kind. It was patient, deliberate, and waiting for someone who had wronged her, a man long thought buried by the sea but not forgotten. The following weeks passed with little disturbance. Eliza Turner's presence, once a novelty, blended into the muted rhythm of Hadleigh life. Her veil grew thinner with the summer heat, and she began taking small errands into the town, purchasing ink, sealing wax, and fine stationery from Mr. Crale's shop. Letters left her door at irregular hours, sometimes delivered by passing carters who swore she paid them double the usual rate for discretion. The recipient of those letters was never confirmed, though later testimony suggested they were directed toward Ipswich, and once to the coastal parish of Orford. Each bore the same seal, a mourning dove pressed into black wax. Her nearest neighbor, Mrs. Linton, recalled that on warm evenings Eliza would hum old hymns softly through her open window, yet never any of joy or praise. One in particular, "Lord, remember me," was heard often enough that the children of the lane took to calling her the singing widow. Mrs. Linton, uneasy, once mentioned it to the parish constable, who dismissed the matter as superstition. Yet something in Eliza's behavior began to change after a stranger arrived one afternoon in early August. He was described as a naval man, tall, sun-scorched, with an uneven gait and a scar across his jaw. The inn's record lists his name as Thomas Gray, though the signature was cramped and could have been false. He stayed only 2 nights, but on both evenings, witnesses saw him walking the lane toward Eliza's cottage just as dusk fell. The 3rd day, his room at the inn stood empty. His trunk, never claimed, contained nothing but a worn Bible and a small bottle of laudanum. The innkeeper assumed he had taken another route toward London. But as weeks turned to months, gossip hardened into suspicion. Eliza was no longer seen at market. Her shutters remained closed even in the heat. Constable Fenton noted in his 1825 report, "Several townspeople remark that Widow Turner's chimney burns at strange hours, oft past the 2nd watch. The odor about her premises, faintly of resin and lime, gives unease. On inquiry, she claimed to have taken up the boiling of soaps, yet no merchant in town sells her supplies in that quantity." Around this same period, the Suffolk Assizes were still discussing the infamous Red Barn case, where Maria Martin's remains had been unearthed after her lover's deceit. The parallels unsettled the county, though few dared speak them aloud. It was said that even the magistrate in Hadley remarked privately, "I'd not have another Red Barn on my hands." Late in September, a boy retrieving his hoop near Eliza's property saw her carrying something heavy toward the orchard. He described it as a bundle wrapped tight in oilcloth. When questioned, he hesitated before adding, "She spoke to it, quiet, like it could answer back." By the following Sunday, her pew at St. Mary's was empty for the first time in months. The vicar marked her absence in the ledger, noting only, "Mrs. Turner, unwell, perhaps traveling." But the coachman said no such lady had purchased passage that week, and behind her shuttered windows a single candle burned steadily, day and night, until it guttered out one evening in November, leaving the cottage in complete, motionless dark. When the frost of 1824 set over Hadley, the Turner cottage appeared lifeless. Smoke no longer rose from the chimney, and the path leading to the gate lay buried in dead leaves. For weeks, no one dared approach, though children sometimes dared one another to touch the latch after sunset. Those who did claimed to hear a faint tapping from within, like knuckles brushing wood. It was not until mid-December that the parish finally intervened. The rent collector, Mr. Wilby, was the first to cross the threshold. His later statement before the coroner remains one of the most haunting in the county archives. The air within was sour, as from long confinement. Curtains drawn, dust thick upon the table, upon the hearth a pot of hardened pitch, and near it the faint outline of 2 chairs facing one another, though only one was present. He found no trace of Eliza, only a locked writing desk, several dried sprigs of lavender, and a ledger marked with initials that were not her own, J.T. The drawer beneath held scraps of correspondence, all partially burned. From the surviving fragments, the constable copied one phrase, "You cannot hide your sins in the sea, Jonathan. The waves return what they take." That single name, Jonathan, shifted everything. For months, townsfolk had assumed Eliza's husband was dead. Now, whispers began that he had returned, perhaps as the man who called himself Thomas Gray. Theories spread. A reunion turned violent, a long-delayed revenge. Constable Fenton reopened his notebook, and this time the magistrate agreed to a formal search. On the morning of January 8, 1825, 4 men pried open the cellar door of the Turner cottage. What they found was carefully recorded, though the report has since lost many pages. The first surviving entry reads, "Soil recently disturbed. Beneath first layer, planks nailed over a shallow cavity. Within, traces of oilcloth and human bone, partial. Lime residue throughout." The discovery drew immediate comparison to the Red Barn murder, still a fresh wound in Suffolk memory. Local papers printed cautious lines. A scene not unlike that which followed the death of poor Martin some years past. But unlike that case, no confession came. Eliza Turner had vanished, and so had the man known as Gray. Further inquiry found that the handwriting on the burned letters matched a Jonathan Turner of Portsmouth, a shipping broker who had disappeared at sea in 1821 following an insurance dispute. Witnesses recalled rumors that he had faked his death to escape debt. If true, the man at the inn might well have been him, resurfacing under a false name. In a deposition filed by Reverend Allenby, he wrote, "She told me once that forgiveness was for those who repent. Her tone then was not of mercy, but of promise." By February, the cottage was sealed and its contents removed to the magistrate's office. Yet one object defied cataloguing: a small wooden box, scorched on one side, found in the ashes of the hearth. Inside lay a wedding band, split clean down the middle. No maker's mark, no initials, just a fracture running through the gold like a line deliberately drawn. The inquest opened in early March 1825 inside the back hall of the Bell Tavern, Hadley's only space large enough to hold the gathering. Farmers, tradesmen, and gentry crowded the benches, their breath clouding the air. A constable stood guard beside the wooden box from the Turner cottage, its charred lid left open for the coroner's examination. Dr. Matthew Berridge, the town's physician, testified first. His notes, preserved in the Suffolk archives, describe the remains found under the cellar planks. Portions of a male skeleton, aged perhaps 35 to 40, fracture of the jaw, older injury, lime applied with deliberation, no garments preserved save a remnant of coarse wool, blue in hue. He added, "There is indication the body was first bound before interment." Those who remembered the stranger at the inn, the man calling himself Thomas Gray, nodded grimly. His age and wound matched the report. Though none could swear to it, the implication settled like ash. When asked about motive, Constable Fenton hesitated before reading from the half-burned letter. "The waves return what they take." The coroner, puzzled, requested it be preserved as Exhibit C. The crowd murmured. Several women crossed themselves. Outside the tavern, sleet began to fall. Reverend Allenby arrived late, carrying his parish register and the pew ledger showing Eliza's attendance, faithful until the week of Gray's arrival. His testimony was brief. "She came to my study once, asking if the church allowed the remarriage of those presumed dead. I told her it did not, unless proof of death was absolute. She left without a word." That single exchange placed her intent in sharper relief. If Jonathan Turner had indeed returned alive, then Eliza, remarried or merely surviving on widow's charity, stood to lose everything: her claim to inheritance, her reputation, and her fragile position in the Commons. Unity. When the coroner pronounced the death willful and secretive, he also admitted there was no evidence of accomplices, no wagon tracks, no purchases of lime or pitch in her name. It was as if the preparations had been done with materials already at hand. The newspaper, the Bury Chronicle, printed a restrained column. "Hadley's affair of the widow Turner recalls the lamentable tragedy of the Red Barn. Once more a woman's resolve, inflamed by deceit, leads to ruin. Her whereabouts remain unknown, and it is feared she met with fate or flight beyond our borders." But in Hadley, people were less forgiving. Mrs. Linton, the neighbor, later confessed that after the inquest, she began finding small prints in the frost near her garden, barefoot, narrow, circling the fence before vanishing toward the orchard. She said nothing until spring, when others began hearing the same soft knocking against their windows, always just before dawn. The constables blamed wind or birds. Yet one old man swore he heard a woman's voice whisper outside his door, repeating the same line that haunted the town ever since. "It is better to bury what will not bloom." As winter gave way to thaw, the cottage remained locked, its shutters warped by damp. And though the magistrate ordered it watched, more than one sentry reported the faint sound of movement inside, like someone pacing softly just beyond the walls. By April 1825, the Turner affair had nearly faded from the headlines, replaced by reports of crop failures and unrest in the wool mills. But in Hadley, the silence around the cottage grew heavier. Travelers avoided the lane after dusk, and even the post rider began taking a longer route to the next village. Constable Fenton made one final entry in his ledger that month. His handwriting trembled slightly, as if from cold or unease. Night patrol, April 11th. Observed faint glow from within the Turner house. Upon approach, discovered all windows still barred. Candlelight visible from beneath door for several moments, then extinguished. Sound. Chair moving across floor, followed by, perhaps, footsteps on the stair. Upon forced entry, interior empty, hearth cold. No intruder found. The report was quietly filed away. A few days later, the magistrate ordered the property sold to recover unpaid rent. No buyer came forward. Meanwhile, a curious letter reached Reverend Allenby, posted from Norwich. It was unsigned, yet bore handwriting strikingly similar to Eliza Turner's earlier correspondence. The letter read, "Sir, you spoke of forgiveness as if it were a burden. You were wrong. It is release. Tell them not to search for me where water meets stone. The tide is already at my door." The vicar turned it over to the constabulary, but they dismissed it as a cruel jest. Yet something about the phrasing, its calmness, its finality, troubled him deeply. He kept the letter folded within his Bible until his death 2 years later. Throughout that summer, scattered rumors placed a woman answering Eliza's description in coastal towns, from Aldeburgh to Lowestoft. She was said to sell small charms made of ribbon and wax, claiming they protected sailors from storms. Others swore she lodged briefly at a public house under the name Mrs. Gray. No record survives of these sightings beyond the local gossip, yet the frequency suggests something more than invention. A retired sea captain, interviewed years later, recalled a woman who boarded his vessel at Harwich in late 1825, bound for Antwerp. She carried a single trunk and refused to give her name. The ship's manifest, however, listed one E. Turner. Whether this was the same woman, none could say. Back in Hadley, the Turner cottage fell to ruin. Ivy swallowed its brickwork, and rain rotted the doorframe. The property was finally demolished in 1831 after a fire, cause unknown. Among the debris, workmen found traces of melted glass and a rusted lock fused shut. The site was never built upon again. Locals say the soil there will not take seed. Flowers planted wither within days. "It is better to bury what will not bloom," the old women mutter, as though repeating both warning and prayer. By the 1840s, the Turner case had become more legend than memory. Newspapers occasionally reprinted excerpts from the inquest, comparing it again to the Red Barn murder, as if Eliza's story were simply another echo of England's darkest cautionary tales. But for those who had known her, or claimed to have, there remained the sense that she had not vanished at all, merely gone where justice required her to be unseen. 2 decades passed before the Turner name surfaced again in any official record. By then, most who remembered the scandal were gone, and Hadley had grown quieter, its market smaller, its youth drawn to factories farther north. Yet in 1846, a curious document arrived at the Suffolk Record Office from an estate sale in Colchester. It was a set of journals, their leather covers warped by sea air, signed only with initials, E.T. The handwriting matched samples preserved from Eliza's known letters. The entries spanned the years 1826 to 1834, an absence of nearly a decade. Scholars later debated their authenticity, but the ink, paper, and idiom aligned with the period. The first page bore a stark inscription, "For the truth unspoken, should it ever be asked." The earliest entries were brief, almost ledger-like, notations of travel, weather, and boarding houses along the coast. Phrases such as "storm off Yarmouth" and "hired room near Lowestoft Quay" suggest she survived beyond the search. But by 1828 the tone shifted. She began reflecting on what she called the debt returned. One passage, now brittle and nearly illegible, read, "His voice came again in dreams, the one I silenced. Yet when I wake, I feel no remorse, only the stillness that follows the tide's retreat. They say bones settle, but I know better. They remember." It was this journal that reignited public fascination with her story. The Ipswich Gazette ran a serialized feature titled "The Widow of Hadley," drawing new visitors to the county archives. Some argued the writings were a forgery designed to exploit the lingering fascination with the Red Barn case. Others, like historian Dr. Francis Ray, noted the precision of detail, street names, dates of weather, even prices for passage across the Channel, none of which were publicly known in the 1820s. Midway through the volume, a single line linked her story, unmistakably, to those earlier tragedies. "Maria was found beneath the barn. I buried mine beneath my hearth." This explicit reference to the Red Barn murder was enough to convince some that Eliza had written the journals herself. Yet their closing pages were more ambiguous. The last dated entry, from November 1834, spoke of a new dwelling near Bruges and a garden that blooms despite the frost. After that, nothing. Reverend Allenby's successor, reading excerpts decades later, described them as neither confession nor repentance, but an eerie acceptance, like one narrating her own haunting. And so, the question shifted from what she did to what became of her afterward. If she had fled across the Channel, did she begin anew? Or, as local legend whispered, did the sea take her at last, fulfilling her own prophecy about water meeting stone? Whatever the truth, the journals vanished again before any official translation was completed. The clerk who catalogued them in 1847 disappeared soon after. His effects later found adrift near Harwich Pier. Only one torn page remained in the archive file, its ink smeared, the words barely legible. "Forgiveness is only the calm that follows revenge." By the 1850s, the Turner legend had slipped quietly into folklore, its details softened and retold by generations of Suffolk storytellers. Fishermen spoke of a veiled woman wandering the docks at dawn, leaving no footprints on the wet boards. Children were warned not to stray near ruined wells, lest the widow take them for her garden. Yet beneath the superstition, local scholars continued to unearth fragments, parish notes, stray letters, and one particularly unsettling affidavit dated 1832. It was discovered among the papers of a retired customs officer, Captain Lionel Meeks, who had served along the Essex coast. His statement, unsigned but written in formal hand, described a chance encounter aboard a coastal barge. "We took on a passenger from the shallows beyond Walton. Woman, English, claimed to be bound for Antwerp. I asked her name. She replied only, 'Names are for the living.' She carried a trunk heavy enough for two, but insisted on keeping it near her berth. At Harwich, she disembarked, saying, 'I've reached the water's memory.'" The phrasing, so eerily similar to lines from Eliza's burned letters, convinced many that Captain Meeks had indeed met her. but skeptics pointed out that by 1832 she would have been nearly 30, and the affidavit offered no physical description. Still, it rekindled unease across the county. That same year, a fire consumed much of the magistrate's office in Hadley, destroying nearly all documents relating to the Turner investigation. Whether accidental or deliberate, no one could prove. Reverend Allenby's Bible, which had contained her final letter, was also lost. Its binding reportedly melted to the lectern during the blaze. Only oral memory remained. In taverns, the story evolved. Some said she had poisoned her husband with laudanum, others that she had buried him alive beneath her floor. A few claimed she drowned herself in the River Brett, and that her body was never recovered. What tied all these versions together was the notion that she had not acted from madness, but from method, as if exacting a promise long rehearsed. The folklorist Hannah Bristow, writing in 1858, collected several testimonies for her pamphlet, Ghosts of the Eastern Counties. She described the Turner haunting as peculiarly silent. No screams, no apparitions, only the sense of breath near one's ear. She concluded that the case reflected a collective guilt, born from the people's failure to protect the innocent in the wake of deceit and greed. Once again, the Red Barn murder was invoked, this time not as comparison, but as precursor. Bristow wrote, "From Polstead to Hadley, Suffolk soil seems to keep its secrets poorly. It gives them back in whispers." By the end of that decade, travelers through the region often noted the absence of birds near the old Turner property, now a barren field beside a withered oak. Farmers refused to till it, claiming their plows struck stone that was not stone. Some said it was merely the remains of her cellar. Others swore it was something else, something waiting beneath. When railway expansion reached Suffolk in the 1860s, engineers surveying the Hadley line stumbled across what remained of the Turner property. Only the faint outline of the foundation survived, half swallowed by bramble. An assistant surveyor named James Elcott recorded in his notebook that the soil, though dry, yields a peculiar odor when disturbed, metallic, sour, and cold. He noted, almost as an afterthought, that two of his men refused to continue the excavation after uncovering what seemed like fragments of glass embedded with hair. The company moved the track 200 yards north without explanation. The site was left untouched once again. Around this same time, a local historian, Mrs. Ada Farnsworth, began compiling a series of essays on unsolved crimes of early 19th century England. She devoted an entire chapter to Eliza Turner, using parish records and interviews with surviving descendants of Constable Fenton and Reverend Allenby. Her research unearthed a peculiar detail, one that connected the Turner case more firmly to its era's darker preoccupations. Farnsworth discovered that both Eliza's handwriting and the peculiar phrasing of her letters bore striking resemblance to excerpts found in pamphlets distributed after the Red Barn murder trial of 1827. Those pamphlets, written by anonymous moralists, often warned women against deceitful lovers and praised the righteous wrath of betrayed virtue. Farnsworth theorized that Eliza may have been influenced by this popular narrative, internalizing its moral lesson, but twisting it into vengeance rather than repentance. Her essay quoted one surviving witness from 1825, a farmer named Nathaniel Hart, who recalled seeing Eliza weeks before her disappearance. "She stood by the orchard fence at dusk," he said, "looking toward the road. I asked if she waited for someone. She said, not someone, something. Then she turned, and I saw her face as pale as milk, yet she smiled, like one who'd finished her duty." Farnsworth's paper was presented to the Ipswich Historical Society in 1864. It drew modest interest, but no resolution. Her peers considered it too speculative, Though one reviewer remarked privately that the author's tone felt less academic than haunted. Still, her work preserved the last credible attempt to reconstruct the affair before memory faded entirely. The same year her essay appeared, a landslide near the River Brett exposed fragments of brick and timber consistent with the Turner cottage. Laborers, clearing the debris, claimed to find an old iron key and a rosary entwined with strands of hair. Both items were delivered to the parish clerk, who, unable to identify their owner, had them buried in the churchyard. At the burial, an elderly woman reportedly muttered, "She's still turning the soil." That phrase, cryptic and oddly specific, entered local vocabulary for decades after. To turn the soil came to mean stirring old grievances or waking what should remain buried. By 1870, the legend of Eliza Turner was less a crime and more a proverb, passed from mothers to daughters in quiet admonition. And yet, when the wind carried across the open field, some swore they still heard the low creak of a chair moving somewhere beneath the earth. In the winter of 1871, a young curate named Samuel Hexton arrived in Hadley to assume duties at St. Mary's Parish. Fresh from Cambridge and skeptical of village superstition, he dismissed the tales of Eliza Turner as parochial folklore. Yet curiosity lingered, especially after he discovered an unlabeled parcel in the church vestry, wrapped in aging cloth, sealed with wax. Inside were the remnants of Reverend Allenby's papers, brittle sermons, correspondence, and a fragment of a letter bearing the familiar black dove seal. The ink had faded to brown, but one line remained legible. "The calm is not forgiveness, Reverend. It is completion." Hexton, intrigued, began compiling what he called the Widow's Archive, intending to publish a factual account separating truth from legend. He interviewed elderly parishioners and pored over fading news clippings. The more he uncovered, the less certain he became. Some details contradicted official reports. Others seemed to come from dreams rather than memory. One particularly chilling testimony came from a woman named Mercy Whitlow, then in her 80s, who claimed to have served as a scullery maid in the Turner household during the early months of 1824. Her recollection, recorded in Hexton's own hand, read, "Mistress Turner spoke softly, yet her eyes were sharp as pins. She made me scrub the floor each morning where the hearth meets the wall, saying it must stay clean so the earth may breathe. Once, when I asked what she meant, she smiled and said, 'You'll know if you listen close enough.'" Hexton's papers, now held in the Suffolk Archive, reveal that he struggled to reconcile such accounts with his clerical training. In his journal he confessed, "Each witness contradicts the other, yet all describe the same unease, as if the house itself possessed memory. I wonder if guilt, too, can take root in timber." In 1873, during restoration of the church floor, workmen uncovered fragments of scorched wood and a corroded hinge. The items bore an uncanny resemblance to those described in the 1825 inquest inventory. The supposed remains of the cellar hatch. No one could explain how they came to rest beneath the chancel stones. That discovery derailed Hexton's project. His writing became erratic, full of ink blots and margin notes about unquiet sleep and footsteps between pews. Parishioners noticed his sermons grew darker, preoccupied with sin's permanence. In his final surviving entry, dated October 1874, he wrote only, "She came to me last night, veiled, and asked if I believed her forgiven. I did not answer. In the silence that followed, I think she knew." A month later, Reverend Hexton resigned his post and vanished. His replacement found the vestry in disarray, papers scattered, candles burned down to the wicks. The widow's archive manuscript was gone, save for its first page, which bore a single inscription beneath his name. "It is not the ghost we fear, but the truth she left unburied. No one ever found the rest, but on certain nights the church sexton swore he heard pages turning softly from within the locked vestry, though the windows stood shut and still. By the late 1870s, the name Eliza Turner had faded from polite conversation, surviving only in whispered tales told at the edges of markets and over hearths on winter nights. Yet history, it seems, resists burial. A new generation of scholars began revisiting Suffolk's unsolved crimes, stirred by fascination with the macabre. Among them was Dr. Ambrose Havelock, a lecturer in antiquarian studies at King's College, London. Havelock's specialty was what he called moral archaeology, the study of how communities mythologize their own guilt. In 1878, he toured Suffolk to gather materials for a book on forgotten English murders. His diary, preserved today in fragments, records his first impression of Hadley. A quiet town, reluctant to speak of the past. The older men turn their faces when one mentions the widow. The young pretend not to know her name, but they do. Havelock met with several of Reverend Hexton's surviving parishioners and obtained copies of his missing notes from relatives who had kept fragments as curiosities. What struck him most was the uniformity of fear, not of Eliza herself, but of her absence. "They talk of her," he wrote, "as though she never left, merely stepped behind the curtain of the years." While lodging at the Bell Tavern, the same room where the original inquest was held half a century earlier, Havelock was approached by an elderly man who introduced himself as Thomas Hartley, grandson of the farmer who'd once seen Eliza at the orchard fence. Hartley produced an object he claimed had belonged to his grandfather, a small glass phial sealed with wax, containing a trace of gray sediment. According to Hartley, the bottle had been dug from the edge of the field once belonging to the Turner cottage. His grandfather swore it had been buried intentionally, along with a note too faded to read. Havelock, curious but cautious, took the phial back to London for testing. The analysis, conducted at a small laboratory in Clerkenwell, revealed traces of lime and mercury, substances once used in early 19th century preservation. That discovery reignited speculation. Some proposed that Eliza had attempted to preserve her husband's remains as proof of his betrayal, an act both criminal and ceremonial. Others suggested she had sought to destroy them completely, but failed. The truth remained murky, made worse by the disappearance of nearly all original records in the 1831 fire. When Havelock returned to Hadley the following spring to present his findings, he found the phial shattered in its case. The innkeeper swore it had broken on its own during the night, though the room had been locked. The gray dust within had scattered across the tabletop, leaving faint residue like fingerprints. Havelock noted the incident dryly in his log. Some histories do not wish to be disturbed. He concluded his chapter on the Turner affair with a single haunting sentence. Of all England's widows, she alone buried twice, once her husband and once herself. When the book was published in 1880, reviewers dismissed it as melancholic fiction disguised as scholarship. But in Hadley, sales were brisk, and some residents swore that after the book appeared, the nights grew quieter, as though something had at last been heard. The 1880s brought industry and gaslight to Hadley, but modernity could not fully erase the old stories. As telegraph lines rose above the fields where the Turner cottage once stood, workmen reported an unnerving pattern. Each morning, one insulator pole near the old orchard was found loosened, its bolts scattered neatly in the dirt. No damage was done, but no one ever admitted to touching it. Among those drawn back to the mystery was Professor Lionel Radcliffe, an antiquarian collector who specialized in judicial artifacts. He visited Hadley in 1883, seeking relics of the Red Barn murder for a traveling exhibition on Victorian crime. Yet what captivated him was not Polstead's infamous barn. It was the Turner affair, whose lingering absence of evidence fascinated him more than proof ever could. Radcliffe's surviving letters describe his visit to the parish clerk, who showed him a small collection of objects long misfiled under miscellaneous, a cracked rosary, a rusted hinge, and that same broken wedding band retrieved in 1825. The clerk admitted they had been found again, inexplicably, in the rubble of the churchyard after a storm. The items had been reburied once before, he said, but some things refused to stay put. Radcliffe purchased copies of the old inquest notes, and, like Havelock before him, saw in Eliza Turner a symbol of England's unquiet conscience. In his lecture at the Royal Historical Society, he remarked, "The widow Turner embodies that moral inversion peculiar to our age, the virtuous wronged woman who turns justice into her own executioner. We pity her not because she killed, but because we understand why." Though his audience applauded politely, local newspapers condemned the speech as unseemly romanticism of a murderess. Yet Radcliffe's fascination deepened. In a private notebook he wrote, "She is less criminal than consequence, a relic of P. Remises made in an age that offered women no lawful vengeance." Later that year, he visited the field at dusk, accompanied by a photographer to document what remained of the site. The resulting plate, now cracked, shows nothing but long grass and a single leaning fence post. Still, Radcliffe claimed that under magnification, faint shapes appeared in the shadowed grass, a hollow, as though something beneath had settled. When the negatives were developed, the assistant handling them swore he smelled brine and lime, though the darkroom was dry. The photographer, unsettled, destroyed the unused plates. Radcliffe published his final notes on the Turner case in 1886, ending with a curious addendum. "I believe her body was never found because she was never truly gone. In the moral imagination of Suffolk, she remains, patient as the earth that hid her secret." He died the following year of pneumonia, contracted while researching near the coast. His personal collection was sold to a London bookseller, but one crate, labeled Hadley Materials, never arrived. The shipping record ends abruptly with the line, "Item in transit, status unknown." To this day, no one knows what it contained. But villagers say that when the wind is strong enough to bend the trees, the faint sound of something rolling along wood can be heard, like a crate being dragged slowly down an unseen road. By 1890, the field where the Turner cottage had once stood was little more than an overgrown hollow, bordered by skeletal hedgerows and wild briar. A new vicar, Reverend Miles Denham, sought to reclaim the area for a parish garden. His plan was practical, even wholesome, to replace the ghost stories with useful soil. Yet what began as an act of renewal soon revived the unease that had slept for decades. On the morning of June 3rd, his laborers struck wood barely a foot below the surface. Expecting roots, they uncovered instead a rotted crate, its nails hand-forged, its dimensions too deliberate for ordinary storage. Inside lay fragments of parchment, several stones arranged in deliberate order, and a woman's glove stiffened by age. Beneath the glove was a single coin, half buried in dust, a silver shilling dated 1824. Denham halted the work immediately, fearing scandal. He sent for the local magistrate, who ordered the contents removed quietly to the rectory. The official report, preserved in the county archive, states only, "Items consistent with domestic origin. Significance uncertain. No human remains found." But the rector's diary paints a different picture. On the night following the discovery, he wrote, "There is an odor clinging to the objects, faint and sweet, not of decay, but of something distilled. The servants avoid the room where they are kept. One swore the glove moved when no one touched it." Within a week, the rector's wife reported hearing low murmurs from the study where the items were stored. "It was like a woman reciting names," she said, though none were ours. The sounds ceased only when the crate was removed to the church cellar. Scholars later speculated that the crate might have been the long-lost shipment from Professor Radcliffe's collection, though no markings proved it. The contents matched his inventory, save one addition, a small phial of gray dust wrapped in linen, identical to the one that had shattered in 1879. The coincidence unsettled even skeptics. A brief notice appeared in the Suffolk Standard. Reverend Denham's attempt at renewal has yielded curious relics. Locals whisper of the Turner widow's hand returned to rest. Officials advise calm. That same week, the church bell tower was struck by lightning during an otherwise clear night. The bell cracked, its sound forever dulled. The event, though natural, was taken by many as a sign that the ground itself rejected disturbance. Reverend Denham resigned 2 months later. In his final sermon, he spoke of sins that ferment quietly beneath foundations. Parishioners said his voice trembled, as though he feared the echo of his own words. The crate and its contents were reburied at the edge of the churchyard without ceremony. No marker was set, and the exact location remains unknown. But for years afterward, fresh flowers appeared there every midsummer. White lilies, arranged in silence. No one ever saw who placed them. And though the legend seemed finally at rest, Hadley's elders still avoided that side of the church at dusk, murmuring, "She's counting again." The turn of the century brought rail travel, electricity, and the illusion that England had outgrown its ghosts. But in Hadley, the Turner story remained a private inheritance, something passed down in half-whispered warnings rather than in books. "Don't walk near the orchard after dusk," mothers told their children, "for that's where the widow listens." In 1901, a school teacher named Clara Henslow moved into the vicarage, unaware of the ground's history. Educated in London, she dismissed superstition and laughed at the villagers' reluctance to speak of the past. When asked about the cottage ruins, she described them as a fine place for children to play archaeologist. Her curiosity, however, soon grew uneasy. Within a month of her arrival, she began reporting odd disturbances. Objects shifting on her desk, the smell of extinguished candles in rooms she hadn't entered, faint tapping from the floorboards near her writing chair. She mentioned it casually in a letter to her sister. "It feels as though the house breathes differently at night, slow, deliberate, and almost kind, yet not human. I sometimes think someone stands behind me, waiting to see what I will write." Her tone darkened as autumn came. Another letter, dated October 14th, read, "The parishioners tell tales of a widow who avenged herself upon a faithless husband. They say she buried him and vanished into the sea. I thought it foolishness, but now, when I pass the orchard, I feel watched, not by malice but by attention, as if she still hopes to be understood." That same week, the headmaster found Clara's classroom empty. Her satchel, coat, and notebook lay neatly arranged on her desk. The notebook contained the beginnings of an essay titled "On the Persistence of Memory in Place." It ended abruptly, mid-sentence. "The earth remembers through." A search of the grounds found no trace of her. Snow began fall, ling that evening, covering the fields by dawn. When thaw came weeks later, a group of children discovered a single glove half buried near the church boundary. A left-hand glove, delicate, the same size and cut as those described in Reverend Denham's account from decades before. The coroner listed Clara as missing, presumed drowned in the River Brett, though no evidence supported it. The file remains open to this day. Locals began to say, "The ground takes one for each generation," a phrase not written but spoken in taverns and over fences, with the resigned certainty of old superstition. And indeed, the pattern seemed to hold. Every 20 to 30 years, someone vanished near the field or the churchyard. A surveyor, in 1874, a clerk in 1847, now a schoolteacher in 1901. The parish records from that winter include a short marginal note beside Clara's name, taken by remembrance. Whether written by the vicar or some later hand, no one knows. But when the church choir rehearses in the still of evening, a second voice sometimes joins them, thin, clear, and out of time. The singers insist it's an echo. The sexton, older and less sure, says softly, "No, it's her keeping count." By 1910, Hadley had entered a new age of curiosity. Spiritualist societies flourished, and seances were held openly in drawing rooms once kept rigidly Anglican. When the East Anglian Society for Psychical Inquiry announced an expedition to investigate lingering phenomena of moral trauma in rural Suffolk, Hadley was among its first destinations. Their leader, Dr. Clement Wade, was a gentleman scientist known for treating ghosts as psychological residue rather than spirits. He described hauntings as emotional fossils, records of great distress embedded in the fabric of a place. The Turner legend, he believed, offered a perfect case study. Arriving in July 1910, Wade's team set up instruments at the site of the old cottage: barometers, thermometers, a photographic plate camera, and a crude electrical device designed to detect magnetic fluctuations. They were joined by a stenographer, Miss Violet Baines, whose personal diary, later published, provides the most detailed surviving account of the expedition. Her first entry begins optimistically. "The people here are polite but guarded. They do not mock our purpose, yet they look upon us as one looks upon surgeons before an operation." For 2 nights, the team recorded nothing unusual. The third night, however, the barometer dipped sharply at midnight, while the air remained still. Miss Baines wrote, "A scent of sea salt and lime arose suddenly from the ground, though we are miles inland. One of the cameras clicked of its own accord. Dr. Wade swore he saw a faint shimmer by the fence, like gauze moving against no wind." The photograph developed the next morning showed the empty field, yet across the lower corner appeared a faint gray curve, almost like the hem of a garment in motion. Wade dismissed it as a flaw in the plate, but others disagreed. Later that week, a local historian brought Wade a parcel of copied documents, among them a transcript of Havelock's diary and the partial journal attributed to Eliza Turner. Wade was struck by a single repeated phrase, "the calm that follows revenge." He told Baines it reminded him of psychic compression, the moment a soul releases its final purpose and diffuses into silence. That night, while taking readings near the church boundary, the team heard what they described as a faint, rhythmic sound, like soil being sifted through hands. When they approached, the air turned markedly cold, and the recording device failed. Baines wrote her final entry before dawn. "We leave tomorrow. The doctor is shaken. He says there are hauntings that arise not from death, but from an act carried out too completely. I understand him now. There is something here that is finished, yet not gone." 2 weeks after returning to London, Dr. Wade was found collapsed in his laboratory, his notes scattered, one sheet marked with a line in smudged ink. "She is not haunting the living, she is haunting the deed." Miss Baines never again spoke publicly of Hadley. When asked years later whether she believed in ghosts, she replied only, "Not ghosts, echoes that still think." And so the field returned to silence. But each time a plow blade scraped its edge, the wind would rise suddenly, carrying a dry whisper through the hedgerow, a voice perhaps, or just the sound of the earth remembering. The Great War swept through England like a fever, and in its wake many old fears seemed petty by comparison. Yet after 1918, as survivors returned to shattered homes and grieving towns, Hadley's churchyard once again became a place of uneasy remembrance. Veterans who dug trenches spoke of the same smell of lime, the same hush before the ground shifted, as if the soil itself could breathe. The old Turner field, long abandoned, was used briefly as a temporary burial site for influenza victims. It was during this grim season that Lieutenant Harold Greene, a former engineer turned archivist, was tasked with cataloging parish records lost or damaged in wartime. Among the boxes sent to him was a warped ledger marked 1824-1832, its pages fused by damp. Inside, pressed between two sheets, he found a brittle scrap of parchment bearing a few legible lines in an unfamiliar hand. "I buried him twice, once in body, once in name. The earth took both kindly." Greene, accustomed to military forensics, recognized the script from facsimiles of the Turner letters held in Ipswich. He noted in the margin, "likely authentic," yet he did not report the find. Instead, he sent a personal letter to the rector. "There are wounds time does not close, only rewraps. You may want to keep this out of the public file." For months afterward, Greene corresponded privately with a local historian, Mrs. Clara Havelock, descendant of the earlier scholar Ambrose. Her notes survive, though the letters themselves do not. She recorded that Greene began hearing soft scraping beneath his floorboards each time he handled the parchment. He joked that he'd brought a bit of Hadley home, but by late 1919 he stopped writing altogether. His landlord later reported finding the flat empty, the walls stripped bare, except for one pinned sheet of paper bearing the same familiar line, "It is better to bury what we will not bloom." By 1920, the parish quietly transferred all Turner materials to the county archive in Bury St. Edmunds. A clerk named Norris oversaw the cataloging process. His inventory lists one envelope containing miscellaneous artifacts of uncertain provenance, sealed and never reopened. The envelope has since vanished from the collection. The new rector, weary of whispers, ordered the Turner field fenced off and consecrated under a different name, Rest Orchard. He hoped, he said, to replace history with peace. For a few years it worked. Children played nearby again, and the tale softened to the kind of fireside story told only when lamps burned low. But one evening in 1924, the centenary of Eliza's arrival in Hadley, a storm rolled in from the coast. Lightning struck the old oak at the edge of Rest Orchard, splitting it clean through. When dawn came, townsfolk found the roots upturned, exposing what appeared to be fragments of brick and iron below. The soil around them, they said, smelled faintly of seawater. It was as if the tide had come in from beneath. And though no one touched the ruins again, the rector's diary from that day contained a single cryptic note written in trembling script. She has remembered her century. By the late 1920s, Hadley had grown quieter, older. The railway bypassed the town, and the new generation, mechanics, clerks, and schoolchildren, knew the Turner legend only as a caution told by their grandparents. Yet silence has a way of keeping its own pulse. In 1927, the county archive began restoring fire-damaged documents for exhibition, hoping to celebrate Suffolk's long and colorful history. Among the items sent for cleaning was the very ledger once handled by Lieutenant Harold Greene. When the conservator, Miss Eleanor Pike, separated the brittle pages, she discovered faint impressions on the inside covers, letters pressed through from another sheet long removed. Under magnification, she discerned several partial phrases: "Forgiveness is the calm," and "beneath the hearth." The archivist dismissed them as harmless bleed-through, but Miss Pike, whose father had served at the archive decades earlier, recognized the connection immediately. Her family had preserved old stories of the Turner affair, tales of the missing journal, and of the parish records that would not stay put. She took a rubbing of the marks before the binding was resealed. That rubbing survives today in a private collection, bearing what appears to be the faint outline of a dove seal at the margin. Soon after the discovery, Miss Pike began reporting sleeplessness. She told colleagues that the ledger made a sound when no one touched it, a kind of slow, hollow tapping, like a heartbeat through paper. Her supervisor dismissed her claims until one morning, when the glass case housing the ledger was found shattered from within. Nothing was missing, yet the room smelled unmistakably of lime and salt. That same week, a local newspaper ran a small piece marking the 100th anniversary of the Red Barn murder, that other crime of deceit and burial which had once overshadowed the Turner affair. The article mentioned, almost offhandedly, that Hadley's own tragedy remains unresolved, its records incomplete. For reasons no one could later explain, the exhibition's attendance fell sharply after that notice. Visitors said the display room felt heavy, that a faint hum filled the air like a whispered breath. One schoolgirl fainted upon touching the glass, claiming she'd heard a woman say, "You've opened it again." Miss Pike resigned shortly after and moved inland, leaving a brief note with the head curator. Some archives breathe. This one sighs. In 1929, the exhibition closed quietly. The Turner materials were boxed and sent to long-term storage in the county's subterranean vault, where they remain catalogued under the bland title, Domestic Case, Unverified. But caretakers who worked the vault in later decades repeated a strange observation. On certain winter nights, condensation would appear inside the sealed display box, as if something within exhaled. When asked about it years later, one elderly guard merely said, "That's just the widow reminding us. She never liked being filed under fiction." The words were spoken half in jest, but in Hadley, even laughter tends to sound like memory. By the 1930s, Hadley's air of superstition had become quaint nostalgia. Tourists from London came on day trips to see England's quietest haunted town, buying postcards of St. Mary's Tower and asking villagers where the Turner house once stood. Few could answer precisely. The field had long since been reabsorbed into farmland, and the old oak that once marked its boundary was gone, felled after the 1924 storm. Only a faint depression in the earth remained, a hollow that filled with rain each spring and dried to cracked mud by summer. That hollow drew the attention of one final investigator, Dr. Beatrice Lyle, a young folklorist collecting rural legends for a study on women in English ghost narratives. In 1933, she arrived with a notebook and a small camera, lodging at the Bell Tavern, unaware that its back hall had once hosted the inquest. Her tone was scholarly, almost dismissive, describing the story of Eliza Turner as an expression of collective guilt and patriarchal folklore. But as her research deepened, her tone shifted. In a letter to her mentor at Oxford, she wrote, "I cannot tell if the legend grew from guilt or the guilt from the legend. Each person I speak with recalls her differently, yet all describe the same feeling, the sense that the ground itself is listening." Lyle conducted interviews with elderly residents, some of whom still remembered fragments of hymns Eliza was said to have sung. One woman, nearly 90, told her, "She wasn't evil. She was waiting. That's worse." Intrigued, Lyle visited the field on a gray October morning. Her diary from that day, preserved in the British Folklore Society's archive, contains her last known entry. "The soil is damp but warm, as though holding breath. I heard a sound like paper tearing below the ground. It may have been the roots shifting." When she failed to return to her lodging, the innkeeper organized a search. They found her notebook and camera at the edge of the field. The camera held one exposed frame. Developed later, it revealed only a blur, an indistinct form rising from the ground, neither light nor shadow, but something between. Some said it looked like folds of fabric. Others saw a face. Her body was discovered 2 days later, 3 miles downstream in the River Brett. The coroner listed accidental drowning. Yet the constable's private report noted that her shoes were clean and dry, her gloves still on her hands, and that she had not appeared to struggle. After her death, the folklore manuscript she had been preparing, Widows of the Silent County, was never published. The drafts that survived show the same phrase recurring throughout, written almost compulsively in the margins. It is not revenge she seeks, but remembrance. When her belongings were returned to Oxford, the curator who unpacked them found a small packet of soil wrapped in linen. It bore a faint scent of brine and something older, like pages left too long in the dark. The packet remains sealed in the folklore archives to this day, marked only with the year and place. Hadley, 1933. By the close of the 1930s, Hadley was no longer spoken of in newspapers or lecture halls. The war that followed would drown all quiet hauntings beneath louder sorrows. Yet the story of Eliza Turner never disappeared. It merely slipped beneath the surface of conversation, as she herself had once done beneath the hearth. During the blackout years, soldiers billeted near the parish church reported hearing soft knocking from the lower vestry at night. They assumed it was rats, until one man swore he heard a woman's voice, clear and measured, counting softly from 1 to 3. When he opened the door, the room was empty, yet the dust on the floor bore 3 distinct impressions: bare footprints, small and sharp-edged, as if pressed by something colder than flesh. The rector ordered prayers said for the restless dead, though none were named. After the war, Hadley modernized in earnest. The old church was restored, the orchards cleared, and a paved road cut across what had once been Rest Orchard. Builders uncovered fragments of brick and lime, but no one kept them. They were carted off with the rubble, dumped in the riverbed near the new bridge. The engineers said the current would wash them away. It never did. Each spring, small pieces of pale stone still surface downstream after heavy rain, smoothed by time but unmistakably shaped by human hands. In 1951, an amateur historian compiling local legends visited the town and asked after the Widow's Field. He was told kindly that there was no such place. Yet that night, while lodging in a cottage near the river, he recorded a brief note in his diary. "Wind fierce tonight. Sounds outside like soil shifting. Once I thought I heard humming." He did not stay another night. And so the tale endures, passed from old to young, embroidered, denied, and rediscovered. Some versions make Eliza a murderess, others a wronged wife whose vengeance the law refused. But all agree on one thing: she never left Suffolk, not entirely. The ground that held her secret remains unwilling to forget. Scholars still mention her name in passing when discussing the Red Barn murder, noting how both women, Maria Marten and Eliza Turner, became symbols of 19th century fear and fascination, their stories blurred between record and legend. Yet unlike Maria's case, Eliza's ending was never found in a courtroom, only in whispers and soil. Even now the field where her cottage once stood resists cultivation. Grass grows thin there, flowers wilt in days. Locals say the earth itself remembers its promise. On quiet nights, when the wind turns inland from the coast, the hedgerows rustle without breeze, and the faint scent of salt and ash drifts through the village. Some say it is the river, carrying the past back to shore. Others, older and less certain, simply listen and nod. For they know the calm that follows revenge can last a very long time, and that in Hadley the dead do not speak to be feared, but to be remembered.